If you had equality between men and women, you couldn't have marriage. Just like people say, well, couldn't we get rid of the bad things about marriage? Couldn't you have gotten rid of the bad things about slavery?
Now, women are property that are exchanged among these men.
It suggests that you would want a complete change in society.
Definitely.
Class change.
Definitely.
Class change means that the institution of marriage must go.
We don't know what love is. It's just a phony word. It has no real definition. I think that whole concept has to be thrown out and redefined, and it won't be redefined until after the revolution.
This is a man's world. This is a man's world. But it wouldn't be nothing without a woman or a girl.
Welcome to another episode of It's a Man's World, the Genesis 3:16 Effect. I am your host, Haley Rose, curriculum developer at the Gnosticis Center for Christian Education and Ministry, where our mission is to proclaim the restorative justice of God and the healing atonement of Jesus. If you're enjoying our content, please remember to like and subscribe and follow the link in the description to check out our website. Here again for our final episode is Rachel Darnall, our voice of expertise on the intersection of theology and women's issues. And today we are joined by our director, Mako Nagasawa. Welcome to both of you.
Yay, it's
Hi,
great to
Haley.
be here with you both. Finally.
Yes,
We're-
final episode.
yeah, we're glad you're both here. So, we've covered a lot of topics in this series from reproduction to labor compensation to political rights. And woven into really every topic we've covered so far is the institution of marriage. And that's what we're turning to today. That opening clip that we just saw, it went pretty hard. So, Rachel, can you give us some context for that?
Sure. So that footage comes from a 1969 TV spot on the radical feminists. We talked about the radical feminists a little bit in episode 1. They were a splinter group from the main feminist branch, and they felt that women's liberation could not be achieved through this kind of slow moving diplomatic reform. They thought that women's liberation was going to require revolution. And as you saw in that clip, part of the revolution that they saw as being necessary was that they were going to get rid of marriage because marriage was a patriarchal institution that could not coexist with women's independence. So, as you can see in that clip, they were a relatively small group within feminism. So, this is not to say, certainly, that all feminists in this period were saying we need to get rid of marriage. That was very much not the case, but this was a real movement that was going on in the late 60s.
This was the first time I saw this clip, and I think I can see why people get alarmed about the 60s, right? Because if this is the only thing about feminism that you know, then it seems like, well, feminism is so radical, and there are people today, I think, who want to look back to the 1950s and say everything was great then because the radical feminists ruined everything. And it is challenging to see why it was that these radical feminists, were out to destroy marriage, but not every feminist was. And I think that's an important distinction to draw because I think, are feminists, but not radical feminists in that sense. We each have our own spouses. We're happily married, and we think marriage is part of God's original design, and that it's good for human culture. And so, I think it is important, though, to ask why did these folks, the radical feminists, think marriage needed to go? Like, what was pushing them so hard in that direction?
Yeah. The radical feminists really believed that, in a very literal sense, the institution of marriage was just a romanticized version of slavery. For instance, at a 1968 protest of the Miss America pageant, the demonstrators showed up and they very memorably were holding signs that compared the pageant to a cattle auction. At a 1969 demonstration, the radical feminists showed up chanting slogans like, "Here come the slaves off to their graves," and "Always a bride, never a person," a play on that old saying, "Always a bridesmaid, never a bride." So they were very much focusing on marriage as being the last thing that needs to come down for women to be free, because they really believed that marriage was a tool of the patriarchy and that all the trappings that came along with marriage, from the wooing or courtship process to the big fancy wedding with a beautiful dress or the house with the white picket fence, all of those things were just window dressings to distract and lure women into this relationship that was fundamentally one person owning another person.
As Christians, I think our first impulse is sometimes to say that we want to defend marriage and say, no, no, it's not about women being enslaved. It's not about that. But in today's episode, just for a second, to Maka's point, to Rachel's point, we just want to take the radical feminist bride slave narrative seriously. Just for a moment, just let's think about it for a second. Genesis 3:16 actually does take that seriously. But first, I think we should reintroduce ourselves to what marriage can and should be when we follow God's original design for mutuality and co-dominion. So if we go back to the garden, let's review what can we learn about marriage from Genesis 1 and 2.
I think the first that we hear of marriage is in Genesis 2:18, and God is saying it is not good for man to be alone, so I will make him a helper as his partner. And that phrase, a helper, a suitable helper, or however your translation renders it, is the Hebrew phrase ezer kenegdo. And the way that you interpret that phrase is going to be so key to the way that you understand the purpose of marriage and also a woman's place in marriage.
Yeah, now the danger of this is that some people will say that a woman was made to be the man's, basically his PA, just being his personal assistant. I think we've all heard this. So he's out exercising dominion, plowing the fields, whatever. So what should she be doing? We all know this course: laundry, sandwiches, taking care of the kids, take his messages, all that home stuff. Is that right?
Well, no. Um,
Mm.
One of the people that all three of us really admire is an Australian biblical scholar named Margaret Mosco. And she writes that the Hebrew word used for helper, ezer, is used 21 times in the Old Testament. And here's the breakdown of how it gets used. It's of a woman in relation to a man twice, human military aid, like an army that comes to your aid, or an ally that comes to aid 3 times, and then God 16 times coming to the help of human beings. So, for example, in Psalm 121, it says, "I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help, my Azer, come from? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth."
Yeah, and I know people don't love the phrase help meet, and I don't blame them because of the associations that have kind of gotten stuck to it. I actually do like this translation for Ezer Kenegdo because back in 1611, when the King James Version was done, the word meet simply meant fitting or suitable or appropriate. And that is a word that actually prompts us to ask, well, if she was suitable, what was she suitable for? Why was she suitable? And the answer, if you look back in the text to what Adam's need was, is she was suitable to solve the problem of Adam's aloneness. So Adam immediately recognizes that when he sees her, when God brings her to him. He says, she is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. So she was an appropriate companion for Adam because of the fact that she was his equal. She was taken from his side and she was therefore made of the same stuff. And she also had the image of God, and that made her the right companion for him. So, this idea of what's called companionate marriage which just means marriage for the sake of companionship. And that started to emerge in the West in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. But we can see it here in the Bible right from the start that that was God's vision for marriage. But companionate marriage is always a threat to any kind of a hierarchical social order because companionship implies that on some level these two people are meeting um, on the same ground, on equal ground. And that is always going to be a threat when you really want somebody to be up here and somebody to be down here.
Yeah. Well, the counter argument to that is that Adam gave Eve a name in verse 23. And so the argument can be, well, that means he's kind of in charge of her, right? Is that what we are agreeing with here?
Absolutely not, because
Mm,
naming does not express authority. It expresses
mm,
knowing.
mm,
And so, when God gives Abraham a name, or Abram God names Abram Abraham, it's saying he knows something has changed about Abraham. And Hagar also gives God a name. Hagar certainly doesn't have authority over God. It's an act of knowing, or saying, I know you, in a certain way. And it's really not that different than giving someone a name today, although in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, there's more kind of a prophetic sense of knowing, especially when parents name their children. So you name qualities that you see in a person.
Yeah. And what I see, especially in Genesis, is that there is special attention drawn to naming whenever the kinship of the person being named and therefore their household status is kind of being called into question or it already is in question and it needs to be clarified. So, for instance, Sarah names Isaac, but she does not name Ishmael. And that indicates that Isaac is being acknowledged as Sarah's son, and he is going to be an heir, and Ishmael is not. Rachel and Leah, very similar situation. They name the sons of Jacob that are born through their handmaids, and that is what designates those sons as full members of the household and heirs versus being slaves. Because if Rachel and Leah had not named those sons, they would simply follow the status of their mothers and they would have been slaves as well. So the name that Adam gives to Eve is really a family name. He's saying that she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. She's saying that she belongs to the human family. And the implication is that if she belongs to the human family, she's a sharer in the human inheritance of dominion.
mm. So we've got one more devil's advocate question here. I've seen this recently in days floating around social media. Okay, if God just invented marriage and women, maybe that's just so humans could procreate and form families. It's as simple as that. Just boom, boom. Is that right?
I mean, you'd be in good company to think that. A lot of
Mm,
civilizations certainly have,
mm,
but not according to the Bible. In Genesis 2:24, immediately after the naming of Eve, the Bible says, "Therefore, or for this reason, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." This is a statement about the meaning and purpose of marriage, and there is no mention of reproduction at all. And that doesn't mean that reproduction wasn't a part of the plan or that God did not intend for them to be fruitful and multiply, like it talks about in Genesis 1. But it's not named as the reason that marriage exists. I mean, if you think about it, God can do whatever he wants. He could have made humans reproduce some other way, he could have made them reproduce spontaneously and without any kind of voluntary act of will. But that's not what he chose to do. Marriage is more than just we need to make more people.
yeah. Mago, what do you think?
Genesis 2 is one of the reasons why I'm still a Christian,
Oh,
because I think the power of this statement is seen by making human marriage. Every new married couple is a new Adam and Eve that is separate from and equal to their parents. right? And so we were talking about social hierarchy before, that this is not to perpetuate a hierarchy. This is for companionship, right? That's what human marriage is for. And it's the companionship that God envisions within marriage that requires the equality. Uh, and so marriage defined this way is a good in and of itself. And it is even in Genesis 2, it's going to be a recapitulation. Every new married couple recapitulates or retells the story of Adam and Eve, not just because it's useful as a tool to reproduce, but because there's something about the image of God in the marriage, bringing together a man and a woman, each of whom is an image bearer, to this kind of union and partnership.
In theory, Christians today kind of generally agree that companionship matters in marriage. I have heard otherwise, and that's very distressing, but very few people would disagree with you got to be a companion to your marriage partner. But there is also a lot of anxiety in the church over the fact that marriage isn't as stable as it used to be. It's not as good as it used to be. It's not like the old days. And a lot of evangelicals actually blame feminism for that. Dale Partridge, a pastor in Arizona, commenting on the divorce of Senator Angela Paxton, says, I'm not saying her husband hasn't sinned, even grievously, but this screams, I'm a closet feminist and my husband won't do what I want. I know it's more complicated than this, but biblical patriarchy prevents the family chaos that often ends in divorce. And David J. Ayers was saying basically the same thing back in 1992 when he wrote in Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. He says, quote, the feminist revolution has made an incredible contribution to the soaring divorce rate. Feminists directly promote eased divorce restrictions. Indirectly, the kind of practical, often financial independence fostered in the new woman has been consistently linked to a heightened risk of divorce. Now, that sounds pretty scary, so I think we need a fact check. Is this accurate?
It is accurate. The facts are correct. It's just really incomplete. He's leaving out a lot of important information. Formal divorces were harder to obtain before 1970. That did not mean, by the way, that people didn't find creative ways to end their marriages. They absolutely did. They found ways to end their marriages pretty much since the beginning of time. For example, annulment was very popular and very easy to do in the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church did not technically allow divorce, but you could say, hey, I think that my wife is actually my second cousin once removed, and we never should have been married in the first place. So that was one thing you could do. You could bring a false accusation of adultery, or one spouse or the other could take a vow of celibacy and say, well, I can't be married anymore, and neither can my spouse because I'm going to go be a nun or a monk. If you could not get out of the marriage by annulment or divorce, sometimes women would get desperate enough that they would actually go by poison and just flat out murder their husbands. This was a happening business for women apothecaries, is making poisons for wives to poison their husbands. Another way that people got out of marriage is a husband would say, well, my wife is crazy and she needs to be taken off to an insane asylum. And that was the end of that marriage. All that said, yes, between 1970 and 1979, there was a big spike in the divorce rate. And that had to do with some very specific things that happened in that decade. In 1970, there was the Uniform Marriage and Divorce Act published by the Uniform Law Commission. And that transformed the way that divorce was handled in American courts. After the UMDA, American courts started shifting from a fault system of divorce to a no fault system. So in a fault system, you have to convince a judge that your spouse is at fault in order for the judge to grant you a divorce. and there would be a list of specific offenses that would constitute grounds for divorce. And some of those might be adultery, desertion, neglect, cruelty. And depending on the judge, it could be very easy or it could be actually impossible to provide enough evidence to convince that judge that you had grounds for divorce. So, in a no fault system, divorce is a much more civil process. It can be obtained by mutual consent. Both spouses just say, we don't want to be married anymore. The whole thing can actually be settled out of court if it's amicable enough. Another factor that came in was just as he was saying in that quote, yes, there was greater financial independence for women. Part of that was because 10.2 million women had entered the workforce and were now earning money. And married women's employment brought a lot of disposable income to families, but it also made divorce a more financially feasible option for women. The other thing that happened was in 1974, the Equal Opportunity Credit Act made it a federal offense for banks to discriminate against women, banks or other credit institutions. And that made it a lot easier for women to not only have money, but actually control the money that they had made. So, taking all this together, feminism does make a tempting scapegoat, but the attitude that we need to put significant legal and economic barriers in front of women so that they can't leave their husbands is exactly why the radical feminists were saying that marriage is slavery. That is coercion, and coercion is not compatible with the kind of relationship that we all say that we want marriage to be, including in Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. They describe a relationship that is loving and in many ways an equal partnership, and that's what they want, but the way they want to get there is not going to take them there.
Right. So it's amazing how coercive a society can be when women cannot own a mortgage or can't own a credit card. Right. I mean, their options are so much more limited. And so to say that it's feminism that caused divorce is to be distracted. It's not looking at root causes. So we have been trying to look at root causes in this series, and I'm so grateful, Haley and Rachel, that you've called attention to these things, like what was the rate of drug use by women who during the 50s seemed to take drugs just to cope with how hard life was. You know, how many therapists were there in the 50s? Did people go to therapy? Or were they just self-medicating or miserable? How many women would have left their husbands if they could have bought a house themselves, right? Or if they had their own credit line? So, you know, those are really important underlying root causes that we need to pay attention to. And I think it's worth saying that the divorce rate has actually been consistently coming down since 1979. I'm in Gen X, and I think Gen X looks at older generations and thinks, well, we have a lot to learn. We don't want to repeat those kinds of mistakes. And so I think it's pretty clear what happened in the 70s. There was a backlog of marriages that really did need to end.
And coercion, right? Like, who could know if my pets actually love me? I won't let them out. Like, they have to stay in the house. I'm not letting them out of the house, so I think they love me, but I don't actually know, and I suppose if I let them out and they came back, then I'd really know, right? Like, but they're bunnies, so I'm not gonna let them out, right? So we have no fault divorce. Now we're not blaming one person in particular, and the church knows this. And the church knows that the law is not going to keep the door closed so the women can't run out into the street, as it were. So, how are they going to make them stay with their husbands? Now it's spiritual coercion. So that brings us down to the topic of the permanence view of marriage. Not everybody has heard of that. So, Rachel, can you kind of explain to us what this is all about?
Yeah, sure. The permanence view definitely happened in the wake of this period where the divorces were spiking. Like I said, it was 1970 to 1979, and in 1984, there was a book published called Jesus and Divorce: The Problem with the Evangelical Consensus. It was by William A. Heth and Gordon J. Wenham. And the evangelical consensus that they are referring to there is that evangelicals generally, even if they didn't agree entirely on what constituted grounds for divorce, pretty much everybody agreed that if you were a victim of adultery, if your spouse had committed adultery, like no questions asked, you were entitled to a divorce, and the law should grant you a divorce, and the church should support you through that divorce. Um, that was what they were arguing against in this book. They argued that those verses were not, quote, exception clauses. They were, in fact, there were no exceptions at all in the Bible for the rule that marriage is a lifelong, unbreakable commitment. So John Piper kind of carried that forward in the late 80s and into the early 2000s. So he did a paper in 1986 called Divorce and Remarriage, a position paper, which he published in his own publication, just pointing out he did not have a peer review process for that. In 2009, he kind of reiterated the message of that paper in his book, This Momentary Marriage. And his view really just echoes Heth and Wenham, but he has this added dimension that makes it actually kind of worse, of comparing a Christian's divorce to their spouse with the idea that Christ would divorce the church. And that's why you don't divorce, because Jesus would never divorce the church.
Mhm.
And he actually says in a 2018 sermon, you are free to break your marriage covenant when Christ breaks his covenant with his bride.
That is a huge guilt trip. And I will believe that when spouses are Christ, because that's not, it doesn't work, right? And it puts women in a really, really tough spot because now you're a young woman, you're considering marrying somebody because that's what the church wants, right? They want you to get married young. That's happening now, right? And you have this impossibly heavy decision because you are committing that you're going to stick with this person absolutely unconditionally, even if they're violent or unfaithful. And so, John Piper, he's a complementarian, and that means, in his view, marriage involves the woman committing to submit to the leadership of the man. And she is going to be agreeing to be his helpmeet, which in the complementarian framework is putting her abilities, her time, her labor all underneath her husband's direction. And when you're saying your marriage vows as a woman, it's kind of like you're signing an employment contract only for the rest of your life. You can never get out. So it's not really looking good for the church right now. It's looking like the radical feminists were kind of had a good point.
Right. And especially when you look at the totality of scripture, that is not what we see. So in Jewish law, even debt servants had more rights than that, right? Because if if a servant, an ebed servant, sometimes is translated slave, I know, I think that's misleading, but in any case, a debt servant was injured by their master because they're living in the household or on the farm or whatever, they were repaid with freedom, including release from any debts they owed, right? And that's the any tooth or being knocked out or anything like that. So just think of modern injuries on the workforce, that type of thing. You remove the person from the place of vulnerability, and a servant could even run away from a cruel master and expect the community to shelter him or her because Jewish law commanded it. And so that is in Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16. The earlier principle or law that I was referring to is Exodus 21, verses 26 through 27. And if that's true for a servant, then how much more is it true for an abused wife or a neglected wife? So the thing that is often missed is in Exodus 21, verses 10 through 11, a wife has rights to leave a husband for more reasons than the husband has to leave his wife, because a wife was more vulnerable. And so if the husband withheld food or clothing or sexual fulfillment,
Hmm.
so not just sex, but sexual fulfillment,
Mm-hmm.
she had a right to leave. And Haley and I, we talked about this in other videos, the Plantation
Mm-hmm.
Capitalism series.
Mm-hmm.
A really good book on this is by Rabbi Dr. William Warren Goldstein, excuse me. He's the chief rabbi of South Africa. It's a book called Defending the Human Spirit: Jewish Law's Vision for a Moral Society. It's amazing.
Mm.
And I want to point out that permanence view is really not a high view of marriage or a high view of the concept of covenant, which is what the permanence view is supposed to be all about. That's their big thing, is we're the only ones who take the marriage covenant seriously. But the nature of biblical covenant, or any covenant in the ancient world, is that it involves consequences for breaking the terms. That's why people would set up covenants, is they wanted that reassurance of, I am so sure that I'm going to deliver on this promise for you, that I am calling down curses on myself if I don't deliver. And in Hebrews, it talks about God putting himself under a covenant to reassure humanity, like, I really mean what I'm saying. So divorce is a very reasonable and actually a very limited consequence for breaking the promises that you make at marriage. And the permanence view requires that the injured spouse and the community that they live in tolerate things like adultery and abuse, because the covenant enforcement mechanism, which is divorce, is not there. And they would not say that. They would say, "Oh, we take adultery very seriously. We take
Mm-hmm.
abuse very seriously." But what they say and what they do is very different, because you can't take it seriously. You cannot bring consequences when your whole thing is, we're taking this away as a possibility. This can never happen to you no matter what you do.
So the permanence view, it's got some problems. It is not the high view of marriage by any means. No consequences, you don't care. But it does make sense if the belief that you're operating from is that marriage and the continuation of marriages, however it happens, is the glue that will hold society together. And if you believe that the purpose of marriage is that it's got to hold everything together, then yes, it would be extremely scary to watch any marriages break up, right?
Right. And they're not totally wrong when they say that, because historically, marriage has provided the scaffolding for the social order. Stephanie Coontz has written a book called Marriage, a History, and this is a quote from that book. She says, "For centuries, marriage did much of the work that markets and governments do today. It organized the production and the distribution of goods and people. It set up political, economic, and military alliances. It coordinated the division of labor by gender and age. It orchestrated people's personal rights and obligations in everything from sexual relations to the inheritance of property." So, totally apart from any kind of religious or moral reasoning, if you are expecting marriage to do all of those important social functions, you cannot afford to leave anything about that institution to chance. And that's exactly what we've seen in human history.
Right.
Kuntz goes on to say this: most societies have had very specific rules about how people should arrange their marriages to accomplish these tasks. For millennia, the maneuvering of families, governing authorities, and social elites prevailed over the individual desires of young people when it came to selecting and rejecting marriage partners. So, if you want marriage to have the kind of stability that it did in the old days, that durability comes at a cost.
Well, of course, marriage is going to be more stable and perform these functions that we're wanting it to when the older generation arranges them It's the only economic option that women have. There's no other choice. And then if you were to dissolve a marriage, if you went through all of that and you could figure that out, there were such significant legal barriers and absolutely unthinkable social and economic consequences, particularly for women. If all of those things are happening, yeah, marriage is going to be stable. That's how it's going to be. But you can't have marriages be controlled to that degree and still expect that it's going to carry out its basic purpose, which according to Genesis 2 is connection and intimacy and companionship. Because if you trap people in jail, you don't really know if they love you. Just like my bunnies, I don't know if they love me, but they are serving the purpose of my companionship. So it's very stable. Believe me, it's stable, but it's not doing what Genesis 2 was supposed to be, right?
Yeah, and God did not bring, I mean, God did bring all of the animals in front of Adam and showed him, like, these are not suitable helpmeets for you. So he
Mm.
probably did actually, Haley, bring a bunny in front of Adam.
Yay.
And the recognition was there that, like,
Mm.
nope, that's not what we're looking for here.
Mhm. That's a thing you own. But
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be a thing that's you that you don't own.
Mm.
But that's why people are wanting to move away from pet ownership and pet parenthood. Like, well, we don't-
They want pet parenthood instead of pet ownership.
Yeah, maybe it's the trick. They want to convince themselves that their pets aren't going to run away because they're like my kids.
Well, they are, unfortunately, but we have to take care of them. I name
Yes.
all the wild animals too. Like, I feel like all of the wild animals are also my companions, so I just name all of them. And I believe it's
Snow
biblical.
White. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Well, okay. Well, Rachel, you wrote a fun article back in 2023 about Jane Austen's stories, and you're demonstrating that a high view of singleness is actually really necessary to having a high view of marriage, right? For exactly these reasons of, well, what's the alternative? Like the alternative has to be there and freely choosable in order for marriage to require the maturity and commitment that it actually does.
Right.
And so I think the same can be said of divorce. So I think in a fallen world, uh, we are going to have very sad and tragic things like domestic violence, infidelity, other forms of neglect and abuse, like one of the spouses gets addicted to something that is harmful to the relationship or to the family. That is going to be part of living in a fallen world. And so, if we're going to have a high view of marriage, we need to design support systems and legal and economic forms of support, especially for women, when and if domestic abuse or neglect happens in our communities. So we need divorce law. I'll just name a few. We need divorce laws that allow the women themselves, not a judge, but the women themselves to assess whether they're physically or emotionally safe in their marriages. We need women's shelters, especially with space for children, because these women need to not feel trapped. We need more affordable housing so that there could be options to not call in the highest degrees of law enforcement, but simply exit the abusive marriage. We need financial literacy programs to make sure women understand how to navigate banks and our financial system and not be exploited. We need pro bono legal services so that they can access them if they need to. So if we don't give women other economic options outside of marriage and some legal help, and then then we tell them that they have to stay in that marriage no matter how they're treated, then I think the radical feminists were right. Marriage is a terrible, terrible deal for women.
Yeah. Fellas, do you want to own a woman or do you want one to love you? Well,
Open the
you
cage door.
you don't, right. You don't get to own someone and truly know if they love you because love is a choice. They have to choose to love you. And that means I have to open the front door, let the bunnies out and see if they turn around and come back in.